abandoned warehouse that stands quietly above the river. Barges were still anchored at the foot of the monster standing in the water half a century ago, but now only kayakers and canoers on water tours stop by the depot of the longtime Danube coal loading funicular. The Danube coal loader was built by Drogis and Banyak and went into service in 1927. The system was designed to load coal directly from the mine to barges via a 3.7-mile ropeway. The station's original purpose was served until 1963, when the cable car was taken out of service and the track and hardware were removed. The Voltotur Foundation, founded in 1994, established the goal of artistic use of the building. Ever since, a kind of creative workshop has sprung up around the building, which is also unique on a European scale. But due to the inability to raise sufficient funds for its renovation, the big dream remains unfulfilled. Number 5. Little Beaver Town. The famous Red Ryder BB gun from A Christmas Story was named after Red Ryder, a mid-century cowboy comic strip character. Due to how well known the syndicated comic was, it once even had its own amusement park. However, today you couldn't even refer to it as a ghost town. In 1938, Fred Harmon and Stephen Schlesinger created America's famous fighting cowboy. Because of the popularity of westerns, the comic strip rapidly expanded into a multimedia empire. They created comic books, radio, and over 35 movies and series, as well as toys, lunchboxes, and guns. Red Ryder and his young Native American sidekick Little Beaver were the main characters in the stories. The Native American boy and his pidgin English are an offensive caricature to today's viewers, but in the 1940s, people couldn't get enough of them. However, by the late 1950s, the Red Ryder's popularity had dwindled along with the rest of the Western genre. The comics artist and Albuquerque resident Fred Harmon was unfazed. In an attempt to replicate Disneyland's explosive success, Harmon declared the time had come to build a Western-themed amusement park centered around the Red Ryder characters and his thriving hometown. On the eastern border of Albuquerque and Carnuel, Little Beaver Town, which catered to exotic fantasies of the Old West, opened in July 1961 along Route 66. Around half of the space was transformed into an American Indian village, complete with teepees and Apache Eagle dancers. The other half of it was a Western town with the Red Bull Saloon, an art gallery with original drawings by Harmon, and lots of shops selling trinkets and souvenirs. Visitors could choose to take a stagecoach ride or see an antique steam train trudging on the town's outskirts. Throughout the day, shootouts between Red Ryder and Ace Hanlon took place at regular intervals. Unfortunately, both the Strip and Little Beaver Town were discontinued in 1964. The amusement park momentarily renamed itself Sage City and was rented out as a film set and a rock and roll concert venue. However, this was also unsuccessful and the park was soon closed. The western town was defaced, damaged, and burned to the ground over time. In 2010, the city of Albuquerque bought the property and renamed it to the Route 66 Open Space, adding to the city's large land conservation effort. Amidst a few volunteer-led cleanups and proposals for a hiking trail system, nothing significant has been done with the property. Little Beaver Town today sits as an empty lot of strange concrete foundations riddled with broken glass and unchecked cacti. It's now abandoned, but ready for another chance at glory like the highway it sits on. Number 4. Herel Island. Herel Island, also known as Kachik Taryuk, is in danger of collapsing. The whalers are long gone, and the Inuvialuit, who formerly called it home, now only visit once in a while as a seasonal camping spot or a stopover while hunting. This 45-square-mile island is in the Beaufort Sea, north of the Arctic Circle, and it's mostly deserted and under threat from erosion and rapidly vanishing permafrost. The island can be an extremely challenging place to live. It's stunning on the one hand, treeless but covered in wildflowers and caribou that wander around. On the other hand, it spends roughly half the year trapped in ice and near darkness, disrupted only by a few hours of twilight. It is also a difficult place to bury the dead. The demand for whale oil and baleen drove whalers to the Arctic in the 19th century, and the island's population quickly grew to 1,500 people. Whalers frequently spent the winter hunkered down aboard their ships, but they also died there. It was a difficult task to dig graves in the tundra. One visitor noted that occasionally fires were lit repeatedly until the ground gave way to a shovel in order to make it easier to pierce the frozen ground. Nowadays, the island is home to 4 graveyards and a few other lonely graves scattered across the bluffs. One cemetery contains the remains of 24 whalers who died between 1890 and 1916. There's also a memorial to the wrecked whaling ship Triton, which sank nearby with its crew. The other includes the graves of 2 Royal Northwest Mounted Police officers who passed away in a 1918 typhoid outbreak. More than 100 Inuvialuit people were also buried as recently as the 1950s in 2 other cemeteries. These memorials are already being harmed by the environment. Wind erosion has started to break down wooden markers and some hilltop graves have shifted. Some remains were even brought to the surface by a frost heave. According to a historic resources report, efforts to repair the damage are thwarted by the Arctic ground's relentless freeze-thaw action. The park management team, in consultation with the Inuvialuit, directed visitors away from these particularly sensitive sites and piled fresh dirt on top of the exposed remains. The island has been selected for UNESCO World Heritage status, and the World Monuments Fund named it one of the world's 100 most endangered places in 2008. However, there are still rough seas ahead. According to a paper published in the Journal of Geophysical Research, Earth's surface temperatures in the region have risen by about 36.5 degrees Fahrenheit over the last century. The CBC reported in 2017 that University of Edinburgh research teams on the island discovered that the land was disappearing at a faster rate than ever before. Some of the island's historic structures have been relocated inland to avoid the reach of rising water, according to Yukon News. But as shorelines erode, there's only so far they can go before hitting unstable ground. What's your favorite island? Tell us in the comments and hit subscribe while you're at it. Number 3. Pablo Escobar's Secret Mansion. Way beyond the Caribbean Sea, past the white sand tourist beaches, rests an island whose way of life has primarily remained unchanged for hundreds of years. About 800 people live on La Isla Grande, a remote island without running water or power lines where they rely primarily on fishing and farming for their livelihood. This idyllic setting piqued the interest of one vacationer who built a now-abandoned palace. Pablo Escobar was the infamous king of cocaine and the original El Patron. An extravagant complex of luxury buildings lies on the far side of the island, hidden and secluded between the tropical forest and the Caribbean Sea. The collapse of the structures reflects the fall of Pablo. At his peak, Pablo Escobar was responsible for roughly 80% of the world's cocaine supply. He oversaw the Medellin drug cartel, which smuggled more than 15 tons of cocaine into the United States daily. He was estimated to be worth $30 billion in 1989. Escobar's life was filled with excess, as one would expect from one of the world's richest men. He owned 15 planes and 6 helicopters, in addition to numerous luxury cars. The Hacienda Nápoles, his opulent home in Puerto Triunfo, included his own zoo of rhinoceros, giraffes, elephants, and a dinosaur park made from genuine prehistoric bones. Escobar's plans for his secret party home on La Isla Grande were no less extravagant. He ordered the construction of a massive complex that included a mansion, waterfront apartments, a palm court centered around a huge swimming pool, and a helicopter landing pad. No expense was spared in providing over 300 rooms for guests and partygoers. He even designed golden shower heads to be fitted in the bathrooms. Escobar's playground was reminiscent of Miami's South Beach in the 1980s. After hours of hiking through the Caribbean forest, a sliver of white concrete through the dense tropical undergrowth can be seen. The old, intricately tiled pathway then transitions from the forest floor to Escobar's palace. A 30-foot luxury speedboat can be seen on its side and has since become overgrown with tropical flowers. The mansion on La Isla Grande, now owned by the government, has progressively deteriorated. The spacious complex is already being reclaimed by the environment, and the once luxurious gardens are now a sanctuary for a family of massive wild pigs. Entering the main mansion, which had been decorated with white tile and marble, reveals that the walls are still stained with pastel blue and coral pink color schemes from the 1980s. The lobby leads to a sprawling courtyard shaded by palm trees and overlooking the Caribbean Sea. An oversized and drained pool dominates the court. As crazy as it may seem, residents still living on the island continue to carry on much like they did before the King of Cocaine arrived. Number 2. Klein Curacao. Travelers can discover an abandoned island after 2 hours of sailing bearing southeast from the former Dutch Caribbean outpost of Curacao. Klein Curacao, Dutch for Little Curacao, is a haunting island that has remained uninhabited for centuries. Only a deserted lighthouse, the shipwrecks of boats it failed to save, a few collapsed ancient stone buildings, and a burial site remain along the silent, flat coral atoll, measuring just over half a square mile. It's a chilling, wind-blown place, unlike many desert islands that conjure up images of tropical paradises. The lighthouse was constructed in 1850 and was once painted a vivid coral pink color. However, it's now abandoned, standing alone in the center of the island. With no natural source of running water, the 2 stories of rooms that housed the lighthouse keepers must have been a desolate place to live and work. Nevertheless, the wooden stairs leading to the top of the lighthouse are still in good condition. The German Navy attempted to establish a base here in 1888 as part of the hoped-for imperial colonization of the Deutsche Karibik. but they were chased away by the remote outpost's windswept conditions when a storm blew away the first foundations of a wharf. The Klein Curacao effectively highlights the island's natural effects. On the tropical paradise's northern side, white beaches, palm trees, and crystal-clear waters can be found. The unforgiving shoreline of pounding surf and ragged coral reefs can be seen on the southern windward side, which is more exposed to the elements. Klein Curacao's shipwrecks can be found there as well. The stocky, worn-down fragments of the oil tanker Maria Bianca Guidesman, which ran aground in the 1960s, looms over the southern beach. By now, half of the tanker has been snipped off and washed away by the ruthless waters of the Caribbean Sea. The remains of a once glorious 30-foot luxury boat have been brutally shattered against the sharp coral reefs right next to the Maria Bianca. Nowadays, numerous companies working out of neighboring Curaçao sail to the island by catamaran and offer day trips to tourists. Many of the crumbling stone structures look like simple houses, maybe once home to traveling fishermen. There is also a simple burial site on the northeastern end, marked by a wooden cross with no name. A trip to Klein Curacao is a visit to a remote, eerie island surrounded by waters where, for many years, piracy was the main source of income. Your only company on the island will be shipwrecks, turtles, lizards, and a beautifully faded pink lighthouse that is now slowly deteriorating into ruin. Number 1. Hitler's Olympic Village. The chilling, abandoned remains of Hitler's Olympic Village on the outskirts of Berlin, little known to most tourists and even Germans, was built for the so-called Nazi Games of 1936. It exemplifies both the Nazi regime's technical clarity and its philosophical absurdity. 2 years before the Nazi Party came to power, Germany was selected to host the 1936 Summer Olympics. Initially opposed, Reich Chancellor Adolf Hitler considered this an opportunity to spread Nazi propaganda and strengthen Germany's military machine. In Wustermark, a neighborhood outside of Berlin, Hitler supervised the building of an Olympic village. The now decrepit complex once housed 4,000 athletes in luxurious quarters, including state-of-the-art dormitories, dining areas, training facilities, and even a swimming pool. In an odd twist, it was intended to give the world a picture of an idyllic, beautiful, and peaceful Germany. The complex was even dubbed the Village of Peace by the Führer, with its layout mirroring a conventional village and each hut named after a German town. However, the German army initially intended to use the complex after the games ended and had complete control over both its construction and layout. Hitler further attempted to impose anti-Semitic politics on the games, advocating to forbid Jews and black people from competing. But this heinous tactic failed after other countries threatened to withdraw from the games. The great African-American sprinter Jesse Owens won 4 gold medals that year, defying this attempt to highlight the superiority of the Aryan race. The Gestapo intercepted a fan's letter to Owens pleading with him not to accept the medal, according to displays at the location. The Gestapo also listened in on all calls made by athletes from the village back to their home countries. German soldiers received medical care and training at the Olympic complex during World War II. It was taken over by the Soviet Army in 1945 and used as a barracks for nearly 50 years until the fall of communism in 1994. The old Olympic Village was mostly left alone until around 2015, when vandalism and souvenir hunting destroyed the majority of the original artifacts. As Berlin's population grows, the western half of the crumbling complex is being developed into townhouses and apartments. This includes the gutting of the original dining hall and conversion into residential apartments as of summer 2019. Lake Michigan. Lake Michigan, located in the U.S., is one of the 5 Great Lakes of North America, with the others being Lakes Huron, Superior, Erie, and Ontario. Lake Michigan is the 3rd largest by surface area and the 2nd largest by volume of all the Great Lakes. And while it may not be the biggest in the history books, if you take a look at a map, Lake Huron is technically connected to Lake Michigan, and in the context of hydrology, they form one body of water. When treated as a single entity, Lake Michigan-Huron, as scientists refer to it, is the biggest freshwater lake according to surface area in the entire world. Lake Michigan is a highly frequented tourist destination located in, you guessed it, the great state of Michigan. The lake has beautiful wide sugar sand beaches as well as giant sand dunes that cascade into sparkling blue fresh water. While hordes of people flock to the surrounding beach towns with hopes of sun tanning and swimming in the Great Lake, many are unaware of its dark history. The lake is well known for its shipping history, and it has been a critical resource for the U.S. during war times. However, mystery seems to surround this lake like a dense fog. Multiple myths exist, one being known as the Ghost Fleet of the Great Lakes. Shipwrecks, as we know, were not uncommon in this body of water. Due to the area's devastating weather patterns, any sea-bearing vessel willing to journey along its waters is at risk of being caught in Mother Nature's wrath. The oldest of the ghost ships is called Le Griffon, and it went missing in the year 1679. The boat was rumored to be cursed, and it's now said to be on an eternal collision course with other vessels in Michigan Harbor, but disappears before ever making contact. Also, the Bannockburn, a Canadian freighter, is another one of these ghost ships that was lost in 1902 on Lake Superior. Witnesses still report seeing the ship. No clear evidence or video has been presented to suggest that this is an actual occurrence. However, the hundreds of sightings makes you stop and wonder, could there really be ghost ships floating around in the Great Lakes? The Lake Michigan Triangle is another widely known phenomena surrounding the Great Lake. Just like the Bermuda Triangle, strange things happen here. The triangle stretches from Ludington to Benton Harbor, Michigan, all the way to Manitowoc, Wisconsin. Within this area of land and sea, a long list of disappearances have occurred since 1891. The year the legend all started, George Donner, the captain of the O.M. McFarland, retreated to his cabin one night after guiding his ship through the chilly waters and was never seen or heard from again. Since then, multiple ships, people, and airplanes have all vanished from within this mysterious triangle. One thing people seem to fixate on is the possibility of a ship or plane just seemingly evaporating into thin air. One of the better-known instances of one of these disappearances is Flight 2501 from Northwestern Airlines. The craft was on course to Seattle when they lost all radio contact after witnesses reported hearing sputtering engine sounds before it went dead. According to reports, the plane was right over Lake Michigan at the time of the incident. However, no wreckage was ever found, and no plane debris was ever discovered after a sonar search was conducted on the lake. In recent times, the public's attention has switched from the disappearances in or above Lake Michigan to the things being pulled out of it. Another mystery has presented itself, and many are left wondering how in the world so many World War II planes ended up at the bottom of this lake. About 200 military aircraft were lost during World War II in the Great Lakes. Although many of the aircraft have been recovered, the majority have not yet been found. Let's start by taking a look at some of these planes that have been pulled out of the water. Before we go on, have you ever heard the mysteries surrounding Lake Michigan? Tell us in the comments below, and if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe. Douglas SBD-2P and SBD-5. The Douglas SBD Dauntless was manufactured by Douglas Aircraft between 1940 and 1944. These planes were created as a means of naval surveillance, as well as dive bombers used primarily in World War II. They had a tremendous impact on the war. The SBD, or Scout Bomber Douglas, was used by the U.S. Navy and was also flown by the United States Marine Corps from both aircraft carriers and land air bases. The SBD is mostly remembered as the bomber responsible for delivering the devastating blows to the Japanese carriers during the Battle of Midway in June 1942. The aircraft received the nickname Slow but Deadly for its amazing way of quietly and secretly creating havoc for enemies at the time. The plane was able to destroy targets from long range, had outstanding maneuverability, and held an impressive bomb load. One of the earlier models was the SBD-2P, which was only designed with the basic original configurations ordered from the Navy. They wanted this plane to be able to provide the U.S. military with photo reconnaissance. Out of the 87 SBD-2s that were built, only a total of 14 of them were created with this additional feature. An SBD-2P plane was pulled out of Lake Michigan in 2009. The most produced version of this aircraft was the SBD-5, which was created at the Douglas plant in Tulsa, Oklahoma. This variant of the plane had a 1,200 horsepower engine and an ammunition supply that was greatly increased from prior versions. One of these SBD-5 models was recovered from the bottom of Lake Michigan in 1994. It had been resting 250 feet below the lake's cold waters for over half a century. It still had its original paint and the pilot's seatbelt buckle inside the aircraft. The pilot, Lieutenant Charles L. Ford III, was trying to land on the USS Wolverine when it crashed. Ford lived through the accident with only 2 deep cuts to his forehead. The aircraft is now on display at the Military Aviation Museum at Virginia Beach, Virginia. Bell P39 Era Cobra. A fighter plane known as the Bell P39 Era Cobra was produced by Bell Aircraft for the U.S. Army Air Forces throughout World War II. When the U.S. entered combat, this plane was known to be one of the principal fighters in service at the time. Americans were not the only ones to use this aircraft, though. The Soviet Air Force, Royal Air Force, Free French, and the Italian co-belligerent Air Force all used P-39s during war times. The peculiar layout of the plane had the engine installed in the center fuselage, which was right behind the pilot. This aircraft was also the first of its kind to be fitted with a tricycle undercarriage, which is a type of landing gear that had one single nose front wheel and 2 or more additional wheels on either side of the plane's center of gravity. Although the mid-engine placement was innovative, the P-39 design was left handicapped by the absence of a turbo supercharger. That meant that it was not well equipped to perform high-altitude work, and it was rejected for use over Western Europe by the RAF for that exact reason. The USSR, on the other hand, adopted this fighter plane despite its design flaws, since most of the air combat they participated in was at lower altitudes. The P39, along with other derivatives like the P63 King Cobra, were some of the most successful fixed-winged crafts ever to be created by Bell Aircraft. Two of these planes were pulled out of Lake Huron, which is connected to Lake Michigan. In April 2014, a diver named David Lisinski was on a boat diving with his son when they spotted the submerged door of the wreckage of the P39 Era Cobra through the murky depths. The aircraft was discovered in 30 feet of water about 5 miles north of Port Huron in Lake Huron. This particular plane was determined to be used in training for the famous squadron of the Tuskegee Red Tails. Another P-39 Red Tail crash site was in the St. Clair River. On December 12, 1943, Flight Officer Nathaniel Rayberg died when he crashed near Algonac. State archaeologist Wayne Lusardi noted that there were 5 Tuskegee Airmen planes lost during training exercises, 4 in Lake Huron and 1 in the St. Clair River. Only 2 of the 5 have ever been found. Grumman FM2 Wildcat. The Grumman F4F Wildcat entered service in 1940 with the U.S. Navy as well as the British Navy, where it was known as the Martlet. The plane was a carrier-based fighter aircraft first used by the British in the North Atlantic, but it was quickly adopted by the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps since the Wildcat was the only effective fighter available to them at the beginning of the Second World War. The Wildcat was highly advanced for its time with speeds of 318 miles per hour. However, it was outperformed by the faster and more maneuverable Mitsubishi A6M0. And from the lessons learned from the superior craft, the F6F Hellcat was developed as a later model to the F4F Wildcat. This new model had better range and relied on superior high-speed performance and power in order to outperform the A6M0. However, the Wildcat was still produced throughout the remainder of the war and served on escort carriers where the much heavier Hellcat could not be used. Later versions of the Wildcat included the FM1 and FM2, which were optimized for small carrier operations. This new model had a much more powerful engine as well as a taller tail in order to cope with the increased torque. The FM2s equipped with deadly bombs were used on the Japanese battleship Yamato, which in turn caused the Japanese fleet to withdraw from battle. In 2012, one of these aircrafts was recovered from Lake Michigan by A&T Recovery. At least 50 aircrafts in total have been pulled from Lake Michigan since the 1990s, and some of them have even been restored and put on display in museums for everyone to see. But still, the question remains: how did so many of these World War II planes end up in Lake Michigan? Well, let's get into it. Mystery solved. Although you may be connecting the Lake Michigan Triangle to a reason for this phenomena, there's a completely understandable explanation as to why so many planes are being pulled from beneath this great lake, and it has to do with military training. Ben Page from the Aviation Museum in Oshkosh has said that during the Second World War there was a lot of training happening right in the middle of Lake Michigan. The U.S. Navy realized after the attack on Pearl Harbor that they needed to train more naval aviators to be able to take off from a moving ship in the event of an emergency. Enemy submarines posed a giant threat of attack if they were to train on the Pacific or Atlantic Oceans, so they came up with a solution. There was already a large naval base located just north of Chicago, and it had space for their ships in the city itself. That Navy base is still known as Navy Pier today. In further detail, Page outlined that the aircrafts could operate out of Glenview, Illinois, and the ships could operate out of Chicago. The planes and ships would meet in the middle of the lake, and that's where they would go and train. Over 15,000 Marine and Navy pilots supposedly completed their training on Lake Michigan. Taras Lysenko, co-founder of A&T Recovery, detailed in a recent article for Mission History magazine that the U.S. Navy decided to train on Lake Michigan because it was a safe place for pilots to practice landing on aircraft carriers. They feared German U-boats along the East Coast and on the West Coast. The Japanese had highly advanced submarines that were capable of shooting torpedoes that could prove devastating to their objective. With the Second World War underway, there was no time to waste when it came to training the military in order to come out victorious. So the Navy bought 2 former excursion ships and then continued to convert them to makeshift flat tops, just like that of an aircraft carrier. These 2 vessels were called the USS Wolverine and the USS Stable. After these renovations were made, around 15,000 Navy pilots were qualified on the ships between 1942 and the end of World War II. Sadly, 130 of these pilots crashed their planes into the waters of Lake Michigan during training. But Lysenko and the A&T Recovery Company seem to have made it their mission to fish these 80-year-old planes out of the frigid waters of the lake in order to present them to the American public. Their recovery team has already pulled nearly 40 planes from the lake so far, and there are sure to be many more. So anyone that's curious about these World War II aircrafts may just need to wait a few more years. And who knows what else they may find down there in the future. Do you think all the planes that went down in Lake Michigan during World War II will be recovered in the next 50 years?
Number 3. Uan Islands Campaign. In 1942, a small Japanese force occupied Alaska's Aleutian Islands. These barren chains of remote, sparsely inhabited volcanic islands are best known for their mountainous terrain and harsh conditions, which include thick fog that sometimes comes out of nowhere, high winds, and frequent heavy rains and snow. They have little military or strategic value, posing the question of why any military would want to occupy them. Some experts believe that Japan saw controlling this territory as an effective way to prevent the US from waging an attack across the Northern Pacific. To the Americans, the presence of a Japanese base in Alaska represented the possibility of future attacks on major West Coast cities like Anchorage, Seattle, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. Japan initiated the Uan Islands Campaign with a 2-day aerial bombing of Dutch Harbor on Unalaska Island. It was the first attack on the continental US in 130 years. They did little damage to the Army Air Force base there, thanks to the US military's swift response. The Japanese returned a few days later with a more organized plan and inflicted much more damage this time with an air attack. American forces located the nearby Japanese aircraft carriers, but bad weather prevented them from counterattacking. Hindered from any further action at Dutch Harbor due to the weather, the Japanese then occupied the islands of Attu and Kiska. At first, American military officials paid relatively little attention to the occupation. They were more focused on other aspects of the war, like preparing for combat in Europe and the South Pacific. In the initial aftermath of Japan's invasion of Attu and Kiska, the response of the US military consisted of little more than occasional bombing rage. 2 months after the invasion, the US built an airbase on Adak Island and began attacking the Japanese at Kiska and patrolling the area with ships and submarines. Throughout the campaign, the American military evacuated indigenous villages in the Aleutians that were home to the Unangaks, also known as the Aleuts. Nearly 900 people were forcibly put onto ships and relocated to the cramped confines of the so-called duration villages throughout Alaska. Only allowed to take 1 suitcase each, they watched as US servicemen lit their churches, homes, and other buildings on fire to prevent them from falling into Japanese hands. Authorities told them that they were being moved for their own safety, but the conditions at the makeshift camps were reportedly beyond inhuman. People were placed in abandoned canneries, mining camps, and other dilapidated buildings with no electricity or running water. They lacked warm winter clothing and were given dirty water and bad food. It was only thanks to their own determination and savvy that the Unangaks defied attempts to cut them off from nearby villages and towns, got jobs, and came up with the money and resources to build their own living quarters with modern plumbing and power. In the meantime, the Japanese relocated the Unangaks people on Attu to internment camps in Southeast Asia. On May 11, 1943, American forces attempted to retake Attu. Things got off to a difficult start due to inclement weather, which caused equipment to malfunction. The troops also experienced a shortage of landing craft and suitable beaches to land on. They were unable to bring all their cold weather equipment ashore, and many soldiers suffered from frostbite. Their vehicles couldn't operate on the tundra, leaving them unable to get where they needed to go. The fighting continued between the Americans and the Japanese, ending in a US victory nearly 20 days later. An estimated 1,200 American soldiers suffered from injuries, mostly related to the severe cold, while 1,148 were wounded in combat, and 614 died from disease. 549 were killed in combat. Accompanied by Canadian troops, the Americans moved on to Kiska, only to discover that the Japanese had evacuated unnoticed roughly 2 weeks earlier under the cover of fog. The US military managed to decode Japanese correspondence regarding Kiska's abandonment, yet continued to attack the deserted base for 3 weeks. During their time there, they faced an equally harsh environment to the one they encountered on Attu. Despite no combat taking place, 313 troops died for various reasons, including friendly fire, disease, vehicle accidents, frostbite, booby traps, and bombs left behind by the Japanese. Japan's invasion of Alaska came as a shock to the American people, who couldn't believe that the Japanese had managed to take over land on US soil. In the years since, the Uan Islands Campaign has been overshadowed by other major events from the conflict, earning it the nickname of the Forgotten Battle and the Forgotten Front. Have you ever heard of the Forgotten Battle? Tell us in the comments and hit subscribe while you're at it. Number 2. The White War. During World War I, Austro-Hungarian and Italian forces went head-to-head in a long, drawn-out battle known as the White War. The conflict took place at extremely high altitudes in the Italian Alps, where 2/3 of the 150,000 deaths it saw there were caused by avalanches, landslides, illness, frostbite, hypothermia, slips down icy mountains, and other effects of the brutal weather and environment. To reach the high peaks they would all call home throughout the battle, soldiers climbed steep mountains, hauling their equipment with them. Some troops spent the entire 3.5-year battle living in crude shelters, tunnels, and caverns. They typically fought in small units, often using the environment to their advantage by pushing boulders onto enemies, or triggering avalanches and burying them in the snow. In a place like the Italian Alps, it doesn't take long for someone to realize that Mother Nature is a stronger and more unforgiving force than any human presence. Just as much as they used the weather and nature as weapons, soldiers also learned that sometimes there was no controlling what happened, and that they too could easily end up in harm's way. This became especially clear in 1916 and 1917. The country saw the heaviest snow of the century, with snow from the mountain slides averaging 26 feet. This made it extremely challenging for troops to stay at high altitudes. On December 13, 1916, an avalanche consumed Austro-Hungarian barracks on Mount Marmolada in northeastern Italy's Dolomite mountain range. It was followed by several more avalanches, which buried both Italian and Austro-Hungarian positions in the area. 270 soldiers died in the first avalanche, and many more were buried alive in the subsequent disasters. There's no official death toll, but experts have estimated that at least 2,000 people have lost their lives, including several dozen civilians, on the day that went down in history as White Friday. The avalanches continued the next day, and it's believed that some 10,000 people died over a 2-day period. When the war ended in November 2018, the remaining soldiers stationed throughout the region simply locked up their barracks and left, leaving behind many of their belongings, appliances, and other things they used during their stay. These shelters, along with the bodies of soldiers who died throughout the battle, soon became encased in snow and ice and forgotten about. White War relics began reappearing during the 1990s as climate change accelerated the melting of glaciers. Since then, an array of perfectly preserved sites and artifacts have been found, along with the remains of fallen soldiers who never received a proper burial. These fascinating discoveries are teaching us a lot about a largely overlooked part of the Great War, where troops endured the conflict's harshest conditions. One wooden shelter discovered in 2017 sits atop Mount Scorluzzo at 10,154 feet above sea level. 20 Austro-Hungarian soldiers lived in the cramped makeshift space throughout the White War, where they saw temperatures as low as -40 degrees Fahrenheit. To say they were eager to leave is an understatement, and the men closed up the shelter and left at the first news of the war being over. The only visitors to pass through before it became covered in snow and ice were locals looking for scrap metal. The site remained untouched for the better part of a century before it was eventually revealed by the melting ice. In it, archaeologists found letters, diaries, weapons, ammunition, food, dishes, bottles, animal skin jackets, straw mattresses, coins, helmets, and other items reflecting the dismal daily lives of the men who languished there. The items were found as they had been left, like an eerie time capsule reflecting a forgotten chapter in world history. As global warming continues to dramatically alter the landscape, there's a good chance that more sites like this will appear in the coming years. Number 1. Battle of Chosin Reservoir. From 1950 to 1953, North and South Korea fought for control over the Korean peninsula in what became known as the Korean War. To the north of the 38th parallel was Communist North Korea, also known as the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK, supported by China and the Soviet Union. Capitalist South Korea fought from the south with the backing of the US and, more broadly, the United Nations. By November 1950, it already appeared as though defeat was imminent for the North Koreans. American and UN forces had penetrated deep into enemy territory on a mission to destroy any remaining North Korean People's Army units. It seemed as though victory loomed as they launched what they thought would be their final offensive at the Yalu River, which sits along the border between North Korea and Communist China. It was in this sparsely populated region that soldiers encountered the most unforgiving winter conditions and some of the harshest terrain of the Korean War. Shortly before the battle, a cold front from Siberia had swept over the region, causing temperatures to plummet as low as -36 degrees Fahrenheit. The ground was frozen, causing certain equipment to malfunction. Medical supplies froze, including blood plasma and morphine, rendering the plasma unusable and requiring medics to warm the morphine shots in their mouth before administering them. Jeep and radio batteries failed to work properly and quickly died, and gun lubrication partially solidified, rendering firearms useless on the battlefield. Meanwhile, the risk of frostbite and gangrene was so high that soldiers couldn't safely rip off a piece of clothing to dress a wound. Shortly after waging the attack, the US and its allies were overwhelmed by 120,000 Chinese soldiers in the area near the Chosin Reservoir. Over the next 17 days, the Chinese surrounded the 30,000 UN command troops who had entered the battle expecting an easy victory. The Americans were swarmed as one unit after another was overrun and destroyed. It wasn't long before the 8th Army retreated south. US forces continued to attack, even after learning what happened to the 8th Army. Units became scattered, and communication was poor as troops faced the same logistical and weather challenges as the men who had been forced to retreat. They struggled on icy roads in some places and got stuck in the mud elsewhere. What started out as a victory soon became a fight for their lives among the isolated troops. It later came to light that General Douglas MacArthur, who commanded the 8th Army during the battle, had ignored reports of contact with Chinese forces on the way to Chosin. Another commander had ordered his men to press on, even after it became apparent that they were fighting a losing battle. One task force commander, Colonel Alan McLean, mistook Chinese soldiers for Americans and ran towards them, acting happy to see them. It eventually became clear that the Americans were fighting a losing battle, leaving them with no other choice but to evacuate. As they made their way to the port of Hungnam, civilians looking to escape the cold and violence sought rescue. In what historians have described as history's greatest seaborne US military evacuation, an armada of 193 ships came to the rescue, evacuating around 100,000 American service members, along with 100,000 North Korean refugees. Speaking with the Washington Post in 2004, Korean war veteran Alexander M. Haig described the Hungnam evacuation as one of the great humanitarian feats ever carried out by US forces, while pointing out how seldom it's discussed or written about. And while it's true that the Battle of Chosin Reservoir went down in history as an obscure but major US military blunder, the efforts to rescue those in need were immense. In his book, Ship of Miracles, former Washington Post reporter Bill Gilbert talks about a small merchant ship called the SS Meredith Victory. Designed to hold no more than a dozen passengers, it somehow accommodated 14,000 refugees. The events at the Chosin Reservoir dramatically altered the nature of the Korean War. Rather than walking away victorious, US forces encountered sheer disaster. Of the nearly 18,000 American casualties and losses suffered during the battle, over 7,300 were non-combat casualties, mostly resulting from the harsh weather. The war continued for nearly 3 more years until an armistice agreement was reached between North and South Korea in 1953. And even though the combat came to a halt, the Korean War never officially ended, and tensions between the North and South remain as high as ever, as countries like the US and China remain involved in their affairs. It's become clear that the Korean Peninsula probably won't ever unite without a lot of bloodshed and force. Their ideals are as different as ever, with South Korea boasting a modern, highly developed economy, while North Korea remains secretive, authoritarian, and plagued by poverty and disease. The demilitarized zone along the 38th parallel, which was demarcated as a result of the ceasefire negotiations, remains one of the most heavily guarded places on Earth. Nearly 30,000 US troops are stationed near the tense border alongside the South Korean military, serving as an ever-present reminder of the lingering hostilities that could once again erupt into violence. Thanks for watching. What did you think of these battles fought in freezing conditions? Which one shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time. Bye!